Egypt, the Nile, a civilization obsessed with eternity, and somehow it still refuses to die. 5,000 years later, people who have never even stepped foot in Egypt still wear its symbols on their skin. That is not history. That is something stranger, something closer to a haunting. Using AI reconstruction, we have brought ancient tomb paintings, fragile papyrus, and worn-down statues back to life in stunning 4K. You are about to see the past the way it actually looked. And what a past it is. The pyramids are so precise, modern engineers still argue about how they were built. Egypt's writing system lasted over 3,000 years. Its doctors performed surgery centuries before anyone else dared try. But behind all that brilliance is a darker truth. This eternal civilization was built by forced hands, and it fell not once, but 3 separate times to outsiders. It should have collapsed in famine. It should have collapsed in civil war. It should have collapsed under invasion. Somehow it kept surviving, until the day it finally did not. So how does a strip of desert along one river become the most powerful civilization on Earth? And how does it all fall apart? Let's begin at the beginning. Picture standing in the middle of nowhere. Endless sand in every direction. The sun pressing down like a hand on your back. Nothing should be able to live here. And then, cutting straight through that nothingness, there is a river. The Nile should not have made a civilization possible. It should have made one impossible. But once a year, the river rose, flooded the land, and left behind a strip of black, fertile soil on either bank. The Egyptians called it Kemet, the Black Land. Outside that strip, the desert remained lifeless. Inside it, everything grew. By around 5000 BC, small farming villages had already taken root along the riverbanks, planting wheat and barley in soil the flood had just refreshed. People who once wandered in search of food now had a reason to stay, a reason to build something permanent. But a strip of farmland is not yet a nation. For centuries, 2 separate kingdoms grew along the river, Upper Egypt to the south, Lower Egypt to the north, each with its own crown, its own identity, its own pride. Then, around 3100 BC, legend says a king named Narmer did something no one else had managed. He conquered the north, crushed its resistance, and placed both crowns on a single head. One man, one throne, 2 kingdoms forced into one. It was a victory built on conquest, not agreement. And that tension never really left. From this moment on, Egypt would always carry 2 identities stitched together. Order and chaos. Unity and division. 2 lands, 1 crown. A thread that would run through everything still to come. A single crown was not enough to hold 2 kingdoms together. So Egypt did something bold. It turned its king into a god. The pharaoh was no longer just a ruler giving orders. He was declared a living god on earth, the link between mortal Egypt and the gods who controlled the sun, the sky, and the flood itself. Question the pharaoh, and you were not just breaking the law. You were defying heaven. This new belief reshaped everything. The priesthood, who claimed to speak for the gods, gained enormous power. The royal family sat above all judgment. And ordinary Egyptians, the farmers, the builders, the soldiers, gained something too, but it was not freedom. It was order, stability, a sense that someone divine was steering the chaos. In exchange, they gave up any real say in their own lives. To run a god-king's kingdom, Egypt built something remarkable for its time, a centralized system of scribes, officials, and tax collectors stretching from the delta to the southern border. Grain was measured, recorded, and stored. Labor was tracked. Disputes were settled by royal officials, not local warlords. While neighboring lands were still ruled by scattered tribal chiefs, Egypt was already running like a single, organized machine. But there was a problem hiding underneath all that order. A god-king's power rested on one promise, that the Nile would flood on time, every single year, and the harvest would come. The pharaoh could claim divine authority all he wanted. He could not actually control the river. And sooner or later, the Nile would remind Egypt exactly who was really in charge. The river kept its promise for centuries. Then, around 2200 BC, it stopped. The floods grew weak. Year after year, the water failed to rise high enough to feed the fields. Crops withered. Grain stores ran dry. The Old Kingdom, the very era that had built the Great Pyramids, began to starve from the inside out. One inscription from the time describes nobles forced to eat their own children just to survive. When the harvest fails a god-king, people stop believing in gods. With no grain to distribute and no flood to explain, the pharaoh's divine authority cracked. Local governors, once loyal officials, saw their chance and seized power for themselves. Egypt split into rival territories, each ruled by its own warlord, each fighting the others for land, water, and control. The single crown that Narmer had forced onto one head 1,000 years earlier was now in pieces. This period would later be remembered simply as a time of chaos, the first intermediate period. By every measure, this should have been the end. A starving, fractured land, ruled by competing strongmen, with no king strong enough to unite it. Many civilizations never recover from that kind of collapse. But Egypt did. Out of the south, a powerful family from the city of Thebes began absorbing rival territories, one by one, through war and through will. Slowly, painfully, the broken pieces of Egypt were forced back together under a single Theban king. The crown was whole again. Egypt had survived its first death, and what came next would push the kingdom further than it had ever gone before. A reunited Egypt did not just survive. It grew hungry. What followed was not a return to the old kingdom of farmers and floods. It was something bigger, an empire stretching its arms outward, north into the Levant, south into Nubia, pulling in gold, timber, and tribute from lands that had once been strangers. Centuries earlier, the architect Imhotep had already shown Egypt what its builders were capable of, designing the world's first major stone monument, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. That ambition never left Egyptian blood. It only grew bolder. Hatshepsut, one of the only women to rule as pharaoh, sent trade ships south to the land of Punt, returning with incense, ivory, and exotic goods that filled Egypt's temples with wealth. Thutmose III, often called Egypt's Napoleon, led army after army into foreign territory, expanding Egypt's borders further than any pharaoh before him. Amenhotep III ruled over a kingdom so wealthy and so peaceful that he spent it on raising temples and monuments across the land. At the heart of it all stood Karnak, a temple complex so massive that pharaoh after pharaoh kept adding to it for over 1,000 years, each one carving their name into a structure built by generations before them. This was Egypt at its absolute peak. Rich, powerful, untouchable. But peaks are dangerous places to stand. Somewhere in this golden age, one pharaoh was about to look at everything his ancestors had built, every god they had worshipped, every tradition they had followed, and decide to tear it all apart. His name was Akhenaten, and he was about to commit the closest thing Egypt had to heresy. For thousands of years, Egypt had worshipped many gods, a whole crowded family of them, each tied to the sun, the river, the afterlife, and the harvest. Akhenaten threw it all away. He declared that only one god mattered now, the Aten, the sun disk itself. Temples to the old gods were shut down. Priests who had held power for generations lost everything overnight. He even abandoned the capital, building an entirely new city in the desert called Akhetaten, a home for his one true god, far from the old centers of power. It was not just a religious change. It was an attack on the very system that held Egypt together, the priesthood, the traditions, the gods who had supposedly guided every pharaoh before him. After Akhenaten died, the backlash came fast. His young son, a boy known to history as Tutankhamun, inherited a broken, divided kingdom. Advisors guided him back to the old gods, back to the old capital, undoing his father's revolution piece by piece. It was not enough to simply move on. Akhenaten's name was chiseled off monuments. His city was abandoned to the sand. Egypt tried to erase him completely, as if he had never ruled at all. But you cannot erase a wound by ignoring it. Akhenaten was gone, his name buried, his city forgotten. Yet the crack he left in Egypt's religious and political identity never fully closed. Egypt had been forced to question its gods once. It would never feel quite as certain again. Egypt had survived a religious earthquake. Now it faced a different kind of threat, one knocking from outside its borders. A new pharaoh stepped forward to meet it. Ramesses II ruled for over 60 years, and he understood something his predecessors had not always grasped, that an empire is only as strong as its ability to defend itself. Early in his reign, he marched his army against the Hittites, a rival power pushing in from the north, clashing in the massive battle of Kadesh. Neither side truly won, but Ramesses claimed victory anyway, carving the story across temple walls for all of Egypt to see. What came after that battle mattered more than the fighting itself. Egypt and the Hittites signed a peace agreement, the earliest known peace treaty in human history, carved in stone and still readable today. Two great powers, exhausted by war, chose survival over pride. Ramesses did not stop there. He carved his legacy directly into the cliffs of southern Egypt, building the temples of Abu Simbel, giant statues of himself staring out across the desert. A message to anyone who passed that Egypt was still powerful, still untouchable. And for a while it was. The treaties held. The temples stood. The empire looked as strong as it had ever been. But strength on the surface can hide weakness underneath. Even as Ramesses ruled, new threats were gathering at the edges of the map. Mysterious raiders the records simply called the Sea Peoples. And inside Egypt itself, the cost of decades of war and building was quietly draining a kingdom that looked, from the outside, completely unshakable. The cracks Ramesses never saw finally gave way. And once they did, Egypt stopped being the one in control of its own story. First came the Libyans, foreign chiefs who slipped into power and ruled as pharaohs themselves. Then the Nubians swept up from the south, taking the throne for their own dynasty. Then the Assyrians invaded with iron weapons Egypt could not match, smashing through its defenses. Then the Persians arrived, folding Egypt into their own massive empire, just one province among many. The land that once called itself untouchable now had a new foreign ruler almost every generation. Then, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great marched in, and something strange happened. Egypt did not vanish. Transformed. Alexander founded a new city on the coast, Alexandria, and under the Greek Ptolemy family who ruled after him, it became something Egypt had never been before, a center of knowledge instead of a center of pharaonic power. Its great library pulled in scholars from across the known world. Egypt was no longer leading with armies. It was leading with ideas. But Greek rule could not last forever either. The final Ptolemaic ruler was a woman named Cleopatra, brilliant, fiercely political, and desperately trying to keep her kingdom independent in a world now dominated by Rome. She allied herself with Roman generals, gambled everything on alliances and love affairs that doubled as survival strategy. It was not enough. Rome was closing in, and this time there would be no Theban rebirth waiting on the other side. In 30 BC, Cleopatra died, and with her, the last Egyptian dynasty ended. Rome took the throne. The age of the pharaohs was over, but Egypt itself never disappeared. Today, over 100 million people call Egypt home, and tens of millions of visitors travel there each year just to stand where pharaohs once stood. Yet modern Egypt faces struggles its ancient kings never imagined. Water security is fragile, with disputes over the Nile's flow now tangled in international politics over dams upstream. Ancient sites face constant pressure from growing cities, pollution, and the sheer weight of tourism itself. The river that built a civilization is now a source of modern tension between nations. And still, Egypt's legacy refuses to fade. Its hieroglyphs gave the world some of its earliest writing. Its monuments still rise out of the desert exactly as they did thousands of years ago. The very idea of an ancient civilization, the picture in your head when you hear those words, is almost certainly Egypt. No other culture left a mark quite this deep or quite this permanent. Which brings us back to where we started. A civilization that built its entire identity around defeating death, around eternity, around living forever in stone and memory. The pharaohs are gone. The gods are gone. But the obsession worked in a way they probably never expected. Egypt did not defeat death. It just became something humanity refuses to let die. If this journey through Egypt's rise and fall kept you hooked, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because the next civilization is already waiting. And as always, we'll see you in the next video.